Hi there, team. It's Jordan. Let's get started on the anterior forearm muscles today. Okay, so muscles are a lot to learn, but I promise there are a lot of generalities that you can make about these groups that are really going to help you kind of try and get through the material. So let's just start off with a brief review here. So remember, the antebrachium is also known as the forearm, which is also known as the area of the body between the radius and ulna, right? So all that area there in the red box, that's all the forearm or the antebrachium. And remember, we're going to be looking at the anterior side. So anterior is like we're looking at someone in anatomical position, so the front of their forearm facing us. Okay, so for each of these muscles, we're going to be looking at the origin, insertion, and action of each of them. And now the really nice thing about anatomy is that if you're looking at something, you can already tell a lot about it. So whether it's like a common function that's shared in a group of muscles, which is true for a lot of them, or a common point of origin or insertion, that's going to tell you a lot about what the muscle is going to do. And just remember also that if a muscle or a tendon does not cross a joint, then it's never going to have an action on that joint, right? So you must have it crossing the joint to actually be acting on a joint. So again, a couple of our generalities here. In general, the anterior forearm muscles function to flex the wrist and digits. Again, that's a generality. Not every single one of them do that, but for the most part, that's something really good to keep in mind. The other generality that you should keep in mind is that the origin of all of these muscles in this compartment, except for one of them, which is pronator quadratus, and we'll get there, is the medial epicondyle of the humerus, right? So here's our human body, here's our arm, our forearm would be down here, and this is the medial epicondyle, and the majority of our muscles in this group are going to be originating from that medial epicondyle. So the best way to study the forearm muscles is by going layer by layer. So we have the superficial, the middle, and the deep layers. And each of these layers or compartments will have just a couple muscles in it. Some of them only have one. So it's nice to remember them, though, by their layer. Let's start out with the superficial. So superficial has a handful of muscles in here. So let's start out, let's just dive right into it, and let's do flexor carpi radialis. So flexor carpi radialis, so you can find it right here, flexor carpi radialis, okay? So that's going to be inserting on metacarpal 2. So coming all the way down here and inserting on metacarpal 2, right? Because this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The thumb is always number 1, same as the big toe. So remember that the insertion is the movable portion, and the origin is the immobile portion of the attachment of that muscle. So remember when I said that almost everything is originating from this medial epicondyle of the humerus? That means this is not going to move, and then this insertion of the muscle is going to be moving towards the origin as the muscle contracts. You can almost imagine it in your brain. So again, flexor carpi radialis inserts on metacarpal 2, and so that's going to be crossing the wrist joint, and it's going to be crossing, it's going to be crossing the wrist joint, and it's also going to have a little bit of sideways action. So this is going to be working to flex the wrist, and then also to abduct the wrist, so abduct. Abducting is when you move away from the body or away from midline. So it's kind of going to function to pull it back to flex, and then also to the side to abduct. And then we have flexor carpi ulnaris, which is going to be inserting on metacarpal 5. So remember, if it's going to be kind of up here starting at the medial epicondyle, it runs closely in association with the ulna. Remember, the ulna is going to be opposite of the radius here. Radius would be right here if you follow kind of the thumb back, and then the ulna is going to be here. So the ulna is actually going to be more medial, at the distal end of the forearm, right? Because there's the little bit of the ulna there. And so flexor carpi ulnaris is going to work to flex the wrist and then also to adduct the wrist, meaning bring the wrist closer towards the body. So flex the wrist and adduct. Next, we have the palmaris longus. So palmaris longus is going to be inserting on the palmar aponeurosis, right? Or the flexor retinaculum also. It's not really pictured here, but it's going to be essentially inserting onto fibrous connective tissue down here. And its action is going to be to flex the wrist. It's a relatively weak flexor of the wrist, but nonetheless, it gets the job done. There's some really interesting variation with palmaris longus if you have time for a quick Google search of that. But there's quite a bit of variation out there in palmaris longus. Next, we have pronator teres. So pronator teres is going to be one of the oddballs in the forearm here that's not going to be a flexor of the wrist. Instead, it's going to do what we call pronation. So pronation is where essentially, if we're looking at the palm of the hand here, because it's anatomical position, then it's going to be flipping the hand over. So you can imagine just flipping the hand. So it's going to be originating also at that medial epicondyle, but then it's going to be inserting over here at the radius. So you can imagine if you're going to contract that muscle, it's going to get shorter, moving towards the medial epicondyle, because that's the origin. Then you can imagine how that would flip the hand. So then the thumb would be coming more medially towards the mass of the body here. So again, that's pronation, more so towards the elbow, right up here. And I threw in this little graphic just to kind of help you visualize the pronation. So remember, this is kind of like how we are in anatomical position, palms facing us, thumbs are lateral, and then the pronation will then cause the hand to flip, and then you'll see the back of the hand, and you can actually see here that the radius is kind of crossing over the ulna there. If you're confused about this action, I would encourage you to look it up on a little YouTube video. There are really nice videos of all the actions at different joints and everything, so that could be really helpful for you. All right. Now we have the middle compartment, and the middle is really nice because it only has one muscle, yay! So the one muscle here is the flexor digitorum superficialis. Now that's a handful. Sometimes they'll abbreviate it as like FDS, flexor digitorum superficialis, but it's good to know the entire name. And a little spoiler here, usually when there's a superficialis, there's going to be something that's insinuating that there's a deeper muscle also. So we'll get to that in just a hot minute. But we have the flexor digitorum superficialis, which is going to be inserting on the middle phalanges of 2 through 5, digits 2 through 5. My little bar is cutting it off there, but you can kind of see. So these are the metacarpals, remember? Metacarpal, and then phalange, and then phalange all the way down to the distal ones there. So if this is going to be inserting on the middle phalanges, 2 through 5, then we're going to see that this muscle is going to have the action to flex the wrist, right? Because it's crossing the wrist joint. It's also going to have the action to flex at the metacarpal phalangeal joint, which is right here. And then it's also going to have the action at the PIP, which I just abbreviated here because it's shorter, but that is the proximal interphalangeal joint of 2 through 5, okay? All right, and then like I was saying, we'll move on to the deep compartment, and the deep has the friend of the flexor digitorum superficialis, and this one is the flexor digitorum profundus. And so the profundus, meaning deeper, is going to be inserting at the distal phalanges of 2 through 5. So remember distal, hopefully the little bar goes away, but the distal portion is right at the end of my cursor there, and it's going to be right through there. Okay, so that's the distal phalanges. So again, if we're going to be going all the way to the distal phalanges, then we're going to see action of flexing the wrist, flexing at the metacarpal phalangeal joints right there, 2 through 5, And then we're going to see action also at the proximal and distal interphalangeal joints, right? If it's going all the way down to the very end, essentially, we're going to see action across all of these joints. Next, we have the flexor pollicis longus. So the flexor pollicis longus, remember pollicis is the name that we give to the thumb. So this is going to be flexing the thumb. So it's going to be inserting at the distal phalanx of digit 1. So way down here, right? Here's the metacarpal, and then the proximal phalanx and the distal phalanx, right? Because there's no middle phalanx in the thumb. It only has the 3. I'm sorry, it only has the 2 as opposed to all the other fingers that have 3. My apologies. So the action there will be to flex the wrist, to flex at the metacarpal phalangeal joint, which is right there, and then to flex at the proximal interphalangeal joint of the first digit, digit 1. Because remember, there's no distal interphalangeal joint because it doesn't have that many phalanx. And then finally here we have pronator quadratus. Now pronator quadratus is going to be doing the same action, right, that pronation, but it's going to be doing it closer down towards the wrist. So this is our oddball here in the group of the anterior forearm in that it originates on the distal ulna. So right, this is the radius here, this is the ulna, so it's going to be originating just about here, distal ulna, and then it's going to be inserting at the distal radius. So all of this stuff is happening away from the medial epicondyle, but he's still in the group. So he's going to be pronating at the wrist. You can imagine this is the origin, staying still. Radius is going to be pulling it, or I'm sorry, it's going to be pulling back from the insertion at the radius. So pronating at the wrist. That thumb is going to come over here. Okay. Thank you for watching. Please contact me via email if you have any questions. A couple of your other classmates have contacted me, and that's been wonderful. So I'm here to help. I'm here for virtual office hours if anyone needs them. Please feel free to reach out, and I hope everything is going well.